All right, Bob. Now it's just us again. Let's talk some Mad Men.
Yeah.
So I have never read the word penultimate so many times in one week, Bob. This week was is the next to the last episode of Mad Men, and pretty much every recap I looked at said penultimate, like they had just learned the word or something like that.
Yeah, and it almost feels like it's more syllables than saying the show before the last one. Maybe not quite.
Yeah,
Penultimate. I guess it's not that many syllables.
but it definitely feels like you're trying to. Hey, this cool word I found. Have you heard it? This is when you use it. Anyway, a lot happened in this episode, Bob.
Yeah.
We are hurtling toward the finale at breakneck pace. Okay, so a few things we need to figure out. Now, what exactly happened in that St. Joseph's client meeting? Why did it happen? And what are the consequences? I think we need to really break this down because I had to watch it a second time, and I'm still only like 85% sure I know exactly what's going on.
Yeah. I think the whole thing comes down to Don versus Peggy, I want to say, even though you could argue that it's Don versus what's his name, Ted.
Ted. Wow, so that is an interesting perspective already, different from mine, because I would say Don versus Ted, but this is why we need to break it down. Okay, give me the Don versus Peggy take.
Well, I think Don and Peggy have a really deep relationship, and Don's conflicted. He doesn't want to let go of her. It's almost like a daddy-daughter thing, which is kind of a weird way to put it, but he doesn't want to let Peggy out on her own too much out of the context of what he thinks is best for her. I think I'm still going with the theory that his rivalry with Ted is all in Ted's head, and Don's not as concerned about that directly. He's only concerned about it as it relates to his relationship with Peggy and what he thinks is best for Peggy. Does that make sense?
That does make sense. So you're saying that Don wants to control or own Peggy, and so he's territorial and and Ted is incidental to that.
Right. And I actually feel like what Don did in this client meeting isn't as bad as apparently everyone thinks it is. In fact, I had to think it through to feel really bad about it for Peggy and Ted, and maybe that's just me not, diving into the ad business culture or something, because it seemed like the client wasn't willing to budge, and we're all assuming that Don had some other thing in his pocket that like would have solved this beautifully and given Peggy and Ted everything they needed to succeed and have the client go with Peggy's brilliant idea that she could win an award for down the road or what have you. But I wasn't seeing it. It seemed like what Don did wasn't too far from how it really could play out. He played a card that was a surprise and to the others in the room, but actually succeeded in getting the client to budge in a way that I guess we'll never know how we were all expecting him to do it.
Yeah, so I agree. I could tell that Ted and Peggy were sort of upset, but I was with you. It's like, well, Don sort of has a reason for what he did. It does seem like he was best for the company. Um, the second time I watched it, I realized better just how ice cold Don was about this. So to put this in sort of the order, the very first thing we see on this storyline is Harry calling Don and saying, "Hey, we got sun-kissed," and Don, I assume that he's really trying to be nice with Ted. Says, "No, we said no. Forget about it." Then Don sees Peggy and Ted at the movie, and then it's like, "Oh, you've seen this a second time now," and he starts to get protective of Peggy, jealous of Ted, whatever it is. That's when he goes into this just ice cold killer mode, and he calls Harry, and then he gets sun kissed in a way that Ted can't refuse it because it's like almost 3 times the billings, and he always has the "I'm looking out for the company" card to play. I'm just doing what's best for the company. You can't get mad at me. And the same thing at that client meeting. Hey, I'm just doing what's best for the company. But
Yeah.
but in that meeting, the second time I watched it, what what I think Don did was he's twisted the knife a little bit. So he just lets that draw out because he had just barely told Ted. Um, I might be getting this wrong. I think he had given some indication to Ted, though, that he thought that they were flirting too much. And then he says, "Well, there's an important reason why Ted wants to go with this idea, even though it's more expensive. Tell him, Ted." And Ted's like, "What are you talking about?" And Don just builds it on. You sure you don't want to tell him? It's okay. Tell him, Ted. And just leaves the silence again. And then was like, what are you talking about, Don? Okay, I'll tell him. And just everyone's wondering what he's going to say. I think that uncomfortable silence was the part that Ted and Peggy hated. That's when he was really trying to embarrass them. Then he comes through with this thing that sort of saves the day. But if he hadn't done it quite that embarrassingly, then I think they might not have been so mad at him. At the same time, Don still has the thing to fall back on. I'm just looking out for the company, and you're not thinking with your head, Ted.
Right. Well, that's interesting. I could see how that long pause could cause it could pile on to the problematic scenario of where that leaves Peggy and Ted. But in the end, the consequence is exactly the same in terms of like they don't get the full credit, or I don't know. I'm actually with Don here. I don't know that this is contributing to his downfall nearly as much as another theme that happened here, which is the continued saga between him and his daughter, which I'm sure we'll talk about. I felt like this one was, and maybe in a brilliant sort of way, was sort of done so that you could teeter on the fence about it, and I'm falling on the side of like not feeling like it's part of Don's downward spiral, but actually he is doing some good things for the company, and I'm sticking with it. I don't know.
So when Peggy comes in and says, "You're a monster," is Don a monster?
No, not for the, maybe, but not for the reasons Peggy thinks, which is kind of funny because Peggy's like, "You're a monster," and everything that's been the downfall of Don this season could be construed as him being a monster, but Peggy's just, flying off the handle with her own emotions, and really, by comparison, it's ironic that he's a monster for the thing that I feel like is least monster-like.
Budget, and Peggy's like, "Stop, just stop. You've killed Ted. You've killed the commercial. You can stop now." So Peggy, I think, has foreseen your argument, and she disagrees. Whether she's right or wrong, who knows? But I think Peggy would just say, "Stop it, Bob." He enjoyed it way too much to just be credit.
Yeah,
Anyway,
yeah. Peggy and I can disagree.
So, well, sure. Let's go into the aftermath of Sally and Don after Sally walked in on Don last episode. Who should we talk about first? Don? What? Now that it's been about a month, what's with Don?
Well, Don continues to get these lucky breaks where things are convenient around him, and then he just has to pay for it, and it goes away. And it feels like, so Don is told, like, oh, there's an opportunity for Sally to go away to this boarding school, because I guess that's the thing to do in the 60s. And Betty's really excited about it in some ways, and Don's like, oh, sounds great, I'll pay for everything. And it's just, you can just see Don even thinking it through, or not even struggling, like Sally to him is a liability. So this is where I feel like the true monster of Don is coming through, because we already saw Don couldn't fess up and have a real conversation with his daughter. He went to her last episode only to cover his own ass and make sure damage control was instigated and he was safe, even though he's like cheated on his wife, his second wife, a bazillion times and gotten away with it. Now his daughter is in on the secret, and he wants to make sure that she's gonna cover for him too. And this all falling into his lap as a solution for that to be solved, taken care of even more directly. It's great for him as the evil monster Don. So that's how I saw it.
So I think you have a good point, and that's exactly. I was leaning more on that last episode before we saw this one. I feel like what we saw this episode makes me start to wonder if that Sally betraying Sally is the bad consequence. Like that's almost worse than Megan finding out, or Betty, or whoever. And the reason I started thinking that was because the very first time we see Don, he's not in his own bed. He's sleeping in the fetal position in his work clothes in Sally's bed, right?
Yeah, that's
so
true.
he's obviously not doing well. What does he have for breakfast? Vodka and orange juice. So he's drinking in the morning. And then at the end, once Peggy calls him a monster, he goes back to sleeping in the fetal position. So I'm starting to think that the very act of betraying Sally was huge for Don. And so obviously he doesn't want to get caught or to have Sally reveal anything about what she saw. But I think in his mind he might think of himself as a monster for that betrayal. That's what this episode started to make me think.
Oh, yeah, okay. I like where you're going with that. I think it complements what I'm saying. That's actually more insight. That's really good because I didn't quite see the internal struggle, but I can see it now. Like maybe this is really hard for him, and he just feels like he's too far gone. He's kind of playing by the script that he knows he has to play by if he wants to protect his marriage or whatever, and that's just eating at him. So that's wow, Don, poor Don, but not poor Don. Weird, right?
It is weird how you feel bad for Don, but he's pretty much made his bed. You know, it's not like
Right.
things have happened to him. He's made his choices. So one other thing getting super interesting is Pete and Bob, their interactions. So we have this whole line that starts with Kenny getting shot in the face, and it looks like he dies, and we don't get to know whether he's dead or not for like 15 more
Yeah, that was
minutes.
crazy.
Anyway, but the upshot is Pete's like, hey, I'll take Chevy. Why not? And then he says, but I want Bob off the account. And everyone sticks up for Bob, actually. Um, and so Pete goes and has a conversation with Bob. And really interesting. We talk about Don staying the same, not changing. But Pete has learned from his past. And he thinks I could do this like I did with Don, just go expose him. But that didn't really work out very well. He says something to Bob. It's like, whatever you people do, you're way better at it than I am at whatever I do. So I think he knows that Bob might be able to twist it and make it go bad for Pete again. So he decides to keep that card in his hand and not play it, hoping that the threat of exposing him he can leverage to far more gain than actually playing the exposure card.
Right. Okay. So you just explained it in a way that makes perfect sense to me, but the way I watched it was quite a bit different than that. I was with Bob when he's like, I don't understand, because Pete's just like comes in and he's like, well, I surrender, and it's like the way he said that phrase is so early in the conversation of learning what happened, and your setting the backstory is helpful as well. I guess there was already a scenario of Pete trying to get rid of Bob, and it didn't work out, and everybody stuck up for him, and I guess that plays into this. But I just felt it was very uncharacteristic of Pete to play the longer game and think that he couldn't win against some low level like Bob, because even though everyone stuck up for Bob before, it's not like they stuck up for him in the same way they would stick up for Don, knowing about Don's past. If Pete were to go back to the same group of guys and be like, but wait, did you know this about Bob? I'm not buying, or at least in the moment, I wasn't buying that as the reason why Pete needs to surrender. And so I was confused. I still think Pete has a lot more clout and just gave up way too easily and uncharacteristically, but
No,
that's
I
how I
think
saw it.
I think you have a good point. I mean, when he tried to pull that with Don, Don was, he was actually working and trying and doing great work. There's like, no, there's no possible way we're going to get rid of Don. And Bob's not quite in that position. He knows Chevy, which is important, but it seems like they could replace Bob if it really came down to it. Um,
Right.
and so you say it's not characteristic of Pete, and I think that's very true, which is one reason I find it so intriguing that that was why I drew the parallel with Don. Always stays exactly the same, but Pete, he's thinking, he's learning from his past, he's maybe trying it a different way this time.
Yeah, and what do you think of the theme or the possibility of Bob being like mini Don or something? Like those two are kind of related in this, way that Pete set up is like, I don't know how you people do it, and it's like, wait, which people? Oh, just Don and Bob, the two people in the world who do this exact thing.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's probably pretty striking for Pete because how come I've got two thorns in my side who happen to have just invented their identities? That is sort of weird for Pete. But yeah,
Right.
I think it's been a big theme of this season. It reminds me of butter versus margarine. Bob is margarine
Yeah.
to Don's butter, or just
Right.
these two different versions. So yeah, it's a big theme. Don just does the same exact thing every time, but now it's margarine instead of butter, which is fair. I don't know, maybe that's a stretch, but yeah, I think you've definitely caught on one of the big themes there. Um, is there anything more we have to talk about with Sally? Sally and Betty, Sally and Glenn, Sally and her prep school friends.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, she did crack a cigarette, or her mom gave her a cigarette and said, "I'd rather you do it in front of me than behind my back," and it felt very the 2013 version of me versus the person trying to be in the context of the 1960s had a inner conflict there, but it actually seemed like a mother-daughter bonding moment in the end, which is kind of funny, but
Yeah, it did. It did. Um, uh, yeah, it was very interesting to see. I don't know if I quite know everything that was going on, like at the overnight stay. It's interesting to see Glenn. Let me ask you this. So Sally overstated things when she got Glenn to beat up Rollo, right?
yeah,
Trying to
she really
force
did.
her sort of suggests rape or near rape or putting a hand on her much more inappropriately than he did because he was a little bit pushy, but I think trying to force Sally is definitely overstating it, right?
Totally, and she even knew that with her smirky face. She when she got Glenn to beat him up, she was like using her oppressed woman power of the day or whatever is how I saw it to like get her way indirectly and get in. I got that dude beat up because he was kind of a douche, but not really as bad of a douche as I set him up to be, because I'm a woman and I can. That's my way of getting things done the way I want them or whatever. So that's kind of how I read it. Um,
Well, there might be something there. I might want to think of it more specifically. Maybe she wanted to be protected by someone, to see someone be fatherly, looking out for her because her dad doesn't do that anymore. I, I don't know.
Yeah, yeah, no, could be, and I, sorry, I don't mean to generalize about all women, even of that era or anything like that. I just saw her following in her mother's footsteps and having to
Mm.
sort of pull the levers behind the scenes as women did, especially in the 1960s, and I see that that's what she's doing for the first time is finding her power in that behind the scenes way.
And realizing the power that she can have, perhaps with her femininity. All
Right.
right. Um, so, anything that you hope to see addressed in the finale, Bob?
I don't know. I feel like unless they do something major, it's going to be kind of anticlimactic. If I mean, what am I going to get as a resolve with Don? He's on the downward spiral. They already did a huge kill off last season as a finale, so it doesn't feel like that's appropriate. Or even though there are some rumors that that could be something
Hmm.
brewing. Um, but then if they don't do something major, it'll feel like a fizzle out. So I I'm saying a
Well,
whole lot of nothing. I don't. It's
well,
hard for me to know what to want.
some of the things that I'm interested in are what happened to Avon and Joan. Did Avon call? Was Joan
Oh,
saved?
right. Yeah, no, that's a good one. I would love to see resolution there or see that play out. That would be awesome.
Sally could still let something slip, and the shit could hit the fan for Don's life.
Yeah,
Um,
but I want to see that. That's the problem with Mad Men is I want to see that play out. I don't want it to be the closing frame or something stupid like that. That because I don't like it when the big reveal, and this happened last season, is like the closing frame, or you don't see the fallout as much as you just see like, and there's the big climax. Like, no, I want to see Don suffer from Sally saying something. I don't want that to be the end. I want that to be enough at the beginning of the episode that we see how it plays out.
yeah, I think Mad Men enjoys giving us blue balls a little bit. And you're also right that unlike Game of Thrones, it's usually the last episode for Mad Men where something big like that happens. So I'm excited to see.